For years, the whole story around Epstein has been, and rightfully so, about his horrible crimes. But there's this other mystery, right? A financial black box that nobody's been able to crack. So today, we're going to try and decode the money.
And this is the number at the heart of it all. Almost $600 million. That's the value of the assets listed in Jeffrey Epstein's will, just 2 days before he died. Now, that's a staggering amount of money for anyone, sure, but it's especially mind-boggling for a guy whose career path makes absolutely no sense.
So that leads us to the big question, the one everyone's been asking for years. Where did all that money come from? Because, let me tell you, the official story, it's just a mess of contradictions.
All right, let's start digging. The very first thing that jumps out is this huge disconnect between what Epstein said he did for a living and the qualifications he actually had. Or, well, didn't have.
I mean, the audacity here is just off the charts. You've got this guy operating at the very top of the financial world, charging millions of dollars for tax advice, but he wasn't a tax lawyer or a CPA. He was managing hundreds of millions, but he didn't have a Series 7 license or a CFA. He was billing himself as some high-powered consultant, and he didn't even have a college degree. It's not just weird, it's a complete paradox.
So, how did he pull it off? Well, you have to look at his early career. His rise wasn't just fast, it was impossibly fast. It was all built on who he knew, not what he knew, back in an era of Wall Street where connections were everything.
And this timeline just lays it all out. In 1976, he gets fired from a high school teaching job, a job he wasn't even qualified for, by the way. That same year, he gets hired at Bear Stearns as a junior assistant. And then, get this, by 1980, just 4 years later, he's a limited partner. A partner at one of the biggest firms on Wall Street? I mean, if you're a finance grad with a fancy degree, this part of the story is probably the most insane thing you've ever heard.
But his time at the top? It was super short. After that incredible 4-year climb, he was out, gone, just 1 year after making partner. It was abrupt, and the official reasons they gave, well, they felt like they were hiding something much bigger.
And after he leaves Bear Stearns, you start to see a real pattern emerge. His entire career, it seems, isn't about being a financial genius. It's about deception, fraud, and, well, some very shady, secretive stuff.
So, if you look at the official record, the reasons he left Bear Stearns seem almost ordinary, for Wall Street anyway. He broke some rules, lending money to a friend, there was an alleged affair, and the SEC dinged him for trying to get around some investment rules. Yeah, it's serious, but it doesn't quite seem to fit the picture, does it?
But then, you see this quote from Alexander Acosta, a former Florida Attorney General. He said he was told point blank that Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. Wow, that just changes everything, doesn't it? It makes you wonder if those so-called minor infractions were just a cover story for something much, much deeper, something that had protection from the very top.
Okay, so after Bear Stearns, Epstein pops up as a top guy at a place called Towers Financial Corporation. It was supposed to be a collection agency, but in reality, it was one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in American history at the time. It blew up in 1993, and investors lost something like $450 million. And Epstein, he was right there, a key player. But somehow, he was never charged.
So, let's circle back. If he wasn't some brilliant investor, and his career was basically a trail of fraud, where did the actual money come from? The most visible source we can point to is this tiny, super exclusive group of billionaire clients who paid him fees that are just impossible to justify.
Client number 1, Les Wexner. You know, the billionaire founder of L Brands, Victoria's Secret, all that. Over about 15 years, Wexner apparently paid Epstein $200 million. For what? For tax, estate, and asset management. And remember, these are all things Epstein had zero qualifications to do.
And then there's Leon Black, the CEO of Apollo Capital Management. In just 5 years, between 2012 and 2017, he paid Epstein $158 million. This one is even more baffling, because Leon Black is a brilliant financier in his own right. I mean, what service could Epstein possibly provide that's worth over $30 million a year to a guy like that?
So look, when you add it all up, we can trace almost $500 million in fees coming from just a couple of guys. But the reasons given for these huge payments are paper thin. It really makes you ask the question, was he getting paid for financial advice, or was it for something else entirely?
But these crazy fees are only one part of the puzzle.
To handle all this money and, to hide it, Epstein used this incredibly complex web of offshore companies. A total shadow network built for one thing: secrecy.
And a perfect example of this is a company called Liquid Funding Limited. This was Epstein's personal offshore hedge fund. He was the chairman, it was registered in Bermuda, and back then, it was pitched as some kind of revolutionary financial engineering.
And this is just a classic shell game. The fund in Bermuda was owned by a holding company in Delaware where the records are sealed. His old firm, Bear Stearns, even bought a 40% piece of it. But here's the kicker. For all his talk about being a financial genius, the fund completely imploded in 2007. All the records show he was actually a terrible investor. He lost a huge chunk of his own fortune.
So this all brings us to the final critical point. When you take the money we can trace coming in, and you put it up against his massive expenses and his huge investment losses, the numbers just don't work. The math is completely broken.
Just look at this. On one side of the ledger, you've got that roughly $488 million in client fees, okay? But on the other side, you have those huge investment losses from liquid funding. You have all the costs of running his businesses in New York and the Virgin Islands. You have his insane lifestyle, the jets, the properties. And then you have the legal fees for more than 75 lawyers. It's not just possible, it's probable that his expenses were just as big as his known income. And then we have this. This is the smoking gun, really. It comes from the Senate Finance Committee. They found that while we can only document about $500 million in fees, his bank accounts saw transactions totaling $1.9 billion. That's 4 times his known income. It points to these enormous hidden streams of cash flowing in and out of his network.
So we're left with one final, unavoidable question. The money trail doesn't lead to a neat answer. It leads to a giant, gaping hole. If the fees we know about can't explain his wealth, and his bank accounts show almost $2 billion was moving around, then what was he really selling? And maybe more importantly, what or who was being bought?